Welcome to Coffee and Conversations, mini episodes by victims and villains, and happy 2021. This is the first mini episode we are doing of this year, and we are spinning off from our spin-off podcast, the Cage Corner podcast, and we are doing the brand new Nicolas Cage Netflix series, which is called History of Swear Words. And joining me to talk about this very vulgar but very informative television program is Mr. Alan Cram.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. I thought I wanted to have someone interesting to do this podcast with. Not to say that any of the other writers that we have on staff isn't, but it's been a while since I've done something like Nicolas Cage or just like podcasted with you that wasn't about like superheroes. Batman. Yeah.
No, that's fair. I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to talk about this because I've got some thoughts.
So we're gonna put this up right up front. Spoiler warning, officially now in effect. You guys can check out all 6 episodes. It's like 2 hours on Netflix. It's like a documentary, which is one of the reasons I love this show so much. But getting into this, what were your general thoughts?
It had a very I love the 80s, I love the 90s type vibe. Like those panel shows that they used to have on VH1 all the time where they would take like 5 minutes to deep dive on a single topic. But here they're just focusing on swear words and doing like a 20-minute episode on that one word and the history of it throughout literature and history and pop culture. And I really enjoyed it. And I don't know if they can make more of it, but I'm happy with the 6 I got.
Yeah, so according to SpongeBob, there are 13 swears, which is always how I hold my barometer of vulgarity. So if you want to look that up real quick. But yeah, I agree. I think that I don't know really how you top this this particular season. I really enjoyed it. I didn't even consider the I Love the 80s or I Love the 90s format. I really enjoyed those shows growing up. They were some of my favorite to watch. And I was just fascinated by all of like the history and like how these words have like transformed and ascended and descended almost depending on who you're talking about over the course of their existence.
I think there was a moment in each episode that made me go like, I never thought of it that way. And the one that jumps to mind, pardon my language, but in the fuck episode, they talk about the word MILF and how that came from American Pie. And then like 8 years later, you have Tina Fey doing a joke on MILF Island on 30 Rock on NBC. I was like, I never thought it came. I was so young when American Pie came out. I never really thought of it as something that wasn't around before then. Cause I had never heard it before that movie. And I was like 5. So it makes sense that I'd never heard it before American Pie. So
that was one of the more interesting aspects of this. Also, I found it fascinating how closely a lot of the swears that we use are tied either to something that was inadvertently like religious or something that's like really sexual. I think that I just never kind of compared or never really thought about that. So when you get into like episodes like on bitch and dick and pussy, you're getting into a lot of the more sexualized vocabulary that this series focuses on. And then when you get into something like damn or even shit, you start to see that there is this like tie to almost religious and kind of like more pure times, I guess.
Yeah.
Damn, I think was probably one of the most interesting aspects in here. I'm a fairly outspoken Christian, and I think it's really interesting just to kind of see the transformation about how this was a originally a biblical term and then over time has kind of made its way out of the Bible more into the public eyes.
Yeah, that one was really interesting to me because I liked how it looked at it through the lens of Gone with the Wind.
Mm-hmm.
And you had them talk about the Hays Code and how it got to that point and what happened after that with Damn Yankees and all this stuff in pop culture that had that word in it in the title. Like, it wasn't even just part of the lines. Like, it was the Village of the Damned, Children of the Damned. Like, it became... You could see that turning point with that film, and you didn't really have that with anything else. So I really found that interesting. Old Hollywood stuff fascinates me, fascinates my wife even more. So that was really interesting to watch for me.
Yeah, like I've always known that Gone with the Wind is one of the most beloved movies of all time, and to kind of understand the impact that using that one famous line, "Frankly, my dear, I do not give a damn," like just how impactful that ended up being moving forward from decades then afterwards was just a fascinating thing to watch, because it's one word. And I think in our generation now, we, as like they explored in that particular episode, we don't really take offense to that word in the way that we do say the F word or, you know, other obscenities. But in that time, it was culturally unacceptable. You really had to fight with the Hays Code to use words like hell or damn. And it's so incredibly fascinating to me to just watch how all of that one line be like not only shook up the Hays Code, but also the way that subsequent media would follow there afterwards for the next couple of decades.
Yeah, it's weird to think that without Gone with the Wind, you wouldn't have Stewie going on damn, 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 like on Family Guy. It's one of those weird domino effects, like Rhett Butler, Stewie Griffin. Like, it's just bizarre. And I think one of the best things about the Damn episode was the opening where you had Nicolas Cage giving all of the readings of every other possibility that they had in that script. And I think that's like the main reason you get Nicolas Cage to host this show.
Just the way that he opened up the series too was so awesome, where he's like trying to use the F word in every possible way to monologue that very first episode. The opening monologue where he takes all of the F-bombs from every film and pop culture movement, whether it's snakes on a plane or Christian Bale freaking out on the set of Terminator Salvation. I took a video of that and saved it to my phone because like, this is the best way to open a TV show. This is why you get Nic Cage to host it. And a little story about that. I saved that video to my phone and I showed it to my wife the next day. And with everything going on in Washington, D.C. yesterday, we had friends who live in D.C. and one of them's a fan of Nicolas Cage. And my wife's like, you need to send that to our friend, because that'll make her day. And she was having a horrible day with everything. I sent it to her, and she responded, "That was amazing. Thank you. I needed that." So I'm just glad that I was able to share that little moment with people and just make their days a little bit better. Yeah, so as I talked about in my review, which you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/reviews to check out the spoiler-free review. But if you're listening to this, chances are you probably have already seen the series and you're diving a little bit deeper with Alan and I. And one of the things that I talked about was this is Nicolas Cage's first television show that he's ever done.
He's got a few in the works, though.
He does, but Netflix beat him all to the punch. And this one, I felt like, to me, like, as much as I loved Nicolas Cage in this, I wanted more Nicolas Cage. Like, if that makes any sense.
They did. Yeah, it is from what I heard about this show and what I saw in the few previews that I did see, it didn't really make it look like a panel show. It made it look like Nic Cage doing a deep dive. I wasn't expecting the panel as much, but I'm still glad. I'm super impressed with the panel that they had. It could be like anything else. When Nic Cage is being full Nic Cage, the only solution is more Nic Cage. Like when he's turning it up to 11, you just need to stick with that and keep going.
Yeah, that was my only complaint about this series, was that I felt like every time I got the Nicolas Cage to the degree that I wanted, either the episode ended or they switched to another panelist. And jumping into some of the panelists, I love the fact that you're getting legitimate, like, scholarly people to discuss such profane words.
Yeah, they had a professor of cognitive science. Mm-hmm. They had a linguist. They had a professor of women's studies, film critics, the author of Holy Shit, A Brief History of Swearing, and the author of Word by Word, The Secret Life of Dictionaries. And she was the lexicographer. She used to work for the dictionary and put words in there. So
yeah, I think her was the most, having her on board was the most impressive to me.
Yeah. But
to hear these like college professors and like very intelligent people take this seriously was such a interesting approach, and I feel like it's really what makes this show so satisfying and so intriguing.
And what really balanced that out for me was the entertainers that they had on, because I don't even want to say comedians, because you had Isaiah Whitlock Jr., who's just an actor who's known for saying shit on The Wire. But you also had Jim Jeffries, Sarah Silverman, Nikki Glazer, Nick Offerman. I feel like if they couldn't get Nic Cage to host this, he was their second choice.
He would have been awesome.
He would have been just as good as Nic Cage. It would have been a different show completely. But Nick Offerman's probably one of the best humorists we have in this day and age. So I was really happy to see him come on as a panelist and to do some of the voiceovers for some of the little sketches they had in between segments.
And I really, really love those sketches, because I don't know if you grew up, but I feel like the best way to kind of compare the animation style to what we saw in this was the Amanda Anaconda. I don't know if you remember that show. It was like this weird show from the 90s and early 2000s.
I do remember that.
That's the kind of show it reminded me, like the animation style.
I'm looking it up to make sure. Yeah, that is the show I was thinking of. Oh man, I have not thought of that in forever.
I do deep dives on nostalgic 90s and below properties. That's why they call me Captain Nostalgia.
So what was the one thing that you learned from this that you're going to take away forever from this show?
I think, honestly, one of the things that really impressed me most was the episode on pussy. And really, like, how that word evolved and initially meant something as simple as, like, it was the equivalent of calling your wife darling. Or in 2020, one language, we would say bae, you know? And I loved that was just so interesting, that a word that we really use to demasculate men in our generation was meant as a term of endearment in, I think it was like the Victorian era. And so just to kind of see that transformation and was just fascinating to me. I really thought that there was, it was interesting the way that they would talk about the stigma around vaginas and like the relationship, like when a man is like talking to another man, and all the slang that they ever use to talk about vaginas, like it's always animals. and it's never outright vaginas, which I just found
Yeah.
interesting, because anytime that I talk to someone about vaginas, it's always vagina.
The one thing I learned from this, and I feel like I learned a lot of like random bar trivia from this show, but the bit that I learned that stuck with me was from that episode as well, where they had the burlesque dancers saying, "You want to see my pussy?" And then they would lift up their skirts and just have kittens tied to their waists, like in their crotch area, and then that's how PETA was formed. Like that's what led to PETA. I was like, okay, did not know that secret origin story. Where's that comic book?
Such a random like historical significance thing. Is just like you see burlesque dancers. You know what? We should make an animal protest group. Call it PETA. And it's just like you're like high on that burlesque.
Not to mention, I have so many questions about how they would get the cats to stay for the whole dance. Like, so many questions, not enough answers. I feel like that's going to be the second season of the show.
Also, I thought it was interesting too. Since we're talking about genitalia in particular, I thought that the history of dick was also very fascinating, because obviously, being two nerds, we know about Dick Grayson, and I think that he's probably one of the most famous men who has gone by that for the last 80 years. Because no one really goes by it, and so it's a nickname for Richard, which in terms you would go from Richard to Rick to Dick. That's kind of how that evolution began. But I thought it was very strange and odd the way that Dick actually used to be also be a term for endearment. It was like the equivalent of bro.
Yeah, I feel like I've known that one too. Was Dick Grayson in that collage of famous dicks that they put up on the screen? Because I remember seeing Dick Clark and Dick Van Dyke and Dick Tracy. Was Dick Grayson on that?
I don't think so. And I think that they only did like actual like living people, not fictional characters.
I mean, Dick Tracy was on there, so
maybe. I don't really remember a whole lot, because I binged this series, whereas you kind of like took your time with it.
Yeah, I don't know if I could have binged this. I did 3 episodes at a time, kind of, and even today I split up the last 3 a little bit. I may have finished the last one right before we got on this call. I really enjoyed it. This really makes me want to go back and watch a lot more of the Netflix docuseries, like The Toys That Made Us and The Movies That Made Us, which have been on my to-watch list, but I just haven't gotten to that point yet. Like, this is pushing me towards them even more.
The Toys That Made Us and The Movies That Made Us are fascinating series, and I would recommend them to anybody. But I also think, too, since, we are a mental health podcast, I enjoy the empowerment of this series as well. When you're talking about the terms the shit and bitch, you can kind of see how people have taken these terms and really brought them up for empowerment. When you're talking about the word bitch in particular, a lot of females will use that word, as well as a lot of the men in the LGBT community, as a term of empowerment and endearment, which I also thought was really fascinating. And you're taking this really negative connotation and you're inverting it and you're owning it, which I thought was something that was very well done, and something that I guess I don't consider as much when you're talking about these words in a modern day setting, but understanding how these words actually originally began, all the negative reputations they went through, and then ultimately coming out on the other side as this very positive and powerful exercise in equality and empowerment was fascinating to see unfold.
Yeah, even looking at something like shit, like you can say something like, this was shit, or this was the shit. Like, just the extremes that these words that might have a really negative connotation to a lot of people can also mean something so positive for another group of people, or it just depends on the mindset and the way they're delivered and who's delivering them. I think deep diving into that was really fascinating to see too.
Another complaint that I had about this series that I really thought they were going to answer was they posed this question in the Dick episode about why men feel it necessary to draw penises. And they never answer it. And I was like, I was waiting on something like very scientific as like a reason as to why it comes, but I like the way that one of the comedians put it is like dick is the only curse word that has its own logo.
Josh, there are just some questions in the universe that we will never know the answers to, and that is one of them.
But I need to know that, especially like when they got into that conversation, I was like, I just immediately was transported back to watching Superbad and the scene where Jonah Hill's talking to Michael Cera and he's telling him about his childhood problems of just like drawing dicks on everything.
Were you surprised, speaking of Jonah Hill, were you surprised that he holds the record for the most F-bombs dropped in a film career?
Bro, so surprised. As soon as they pose that question, Sam Jackson. It's got to be Sam Jackson.
You would think so, but I knew going into this it was Jonah Hill. I knew it wasn't Sam Jackson. I forget who else was on the list. DiCaprio was on there, and I think Pacino.
Like, I could see either one of those two actors taking it, but Jonah Hill just seems like a complete left field for me in terms of most F-bombs used in film.
I mean, have you seen Wolf of Wall Street?
I have not. But okay. I know that they said it, they talked about it in the series that it's like 117 or like 107 alone in that particular movie.
Okay, so rounding out the list was... Let me get the actual list up here because that was just an article about it. So Jonah Hill, Leonardo DiCaprio, Sam Jackson's third with 301 uses. Adam Sandler, which feels weird to me.
Bro, Uncut Gems. Put him up there.
I guess.
But I'm also curious though. Like, had Sam Jackson not done the MCU movies, do you think that his numbers would be up there, like greater?
Possibly. Yeah, I mean, he takes a hit with not being able to say the F word in The Incredibles 2. So,
true. We got close to it in Captain Marvel, but it didn't happen.
Yeah. Al Pacino, Denzel Washington, Billy Bob Thornton, Seth Rogen, Bradley Cooper, and Danny McBride. See, the rest of those, I can see having it. Adam Sandler still feels weird to me.
I'm telling you, man. I think the last thing I want to talk about really is in the F word episode. They talked about the development. Maybe it wasn't the F word. Maybe it was shit. But they talked about in one of the episodes about the 1985 hearings with Dee Snider and how he like went to go protest like against, basically to save the First Amendment right of freedom of speech because people were pushing back against it. And in 1990, we got the parental advisory explicit content label that was slapped on music. And one of the things that I had never considered about that moment in history was the growth of hip hop. And how the black community felt that it was racist to kind of have this like cap on your freedom of speech right as hip hop is starting to become this like tour de force in like the commercial scene of music. Yeah,
it's interesting looking back at that on hindsight through that lens, which is not something I ever really thought about. It is really, really strange timing that's when it happened because I don't think it's a coincidence. I think that's the way things worked in the 80s. There was a lot more covert racism back then, like not direct as much, but like, yeah, we're gonna do this, and oh, well, this is just how it works. I'm sorry, and it makes you want to take a shower.
It's interesting too to consider censorship within entertainment, because right around the time that these hearings start, we're only a year or two removed from conversations being talked about with the MPAA, where you're saying we need a rating that needs to go between PG and R, because when you go back and look at movies like Gremlins, they were considered scary. You even looking at something like Poltergeist, which was released in '82, that is a downright horror movie, and it's rated PG, which, you know, is probably by today's standards should be rated PG-13 or R. And they were saying the same about like Indiana Jones, and you know, also at the same time, Spaceballs had the F word in it, and you know, so you had that censorship also being brought to film, and then equally to music right around the same time. And it's weird that it, like, the timing worked out that way, because I don't think it took as long for the MPAA to come out with the PG-13 rating once those hearings began, but it took 5 years. And in that 5 years, you really kind of started to see a rise in gangster rap, you know, artists like NWA, Public Enemy, really starting to come into their own and really starting to take the genre of gangster rap to new heights that we had never seen before, and it was really taking hip-hop into some bold, beautiful new eras.
I don't really have much else.
Well, all right. On a scale of 1 to 5, what would you give this series?
I'd give it a 4. It's only missing that last one because it needed more Nic Cage. So
great minds. I knew that you were the right person to bring on this episode, because I'm also going to give it a 4 again. Just wanting more Nicolas Cage. I felt like the series, I felt like, was robbed of that, but I enjoyed what we got of him, and it kind of felt like that appropriate tease to what we're going to be getting in the near future with his Tiger King series.
Not even just the Tiger King series, but he also has a film coming out called The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, where he plays himself. So Nic Cage is folding in on himself and just becoming this supernova of awesomeness and craziness. And like, it's just, by the time we get to the Joe Exotic show, it's just going to be insane.
It's also worth mentioning that Pedro Pascal is also in that movie. And,
The Weight of Massive Talent?
Yeah, it has an incredible cast. It is one of my most anticipated movies this year.
I cannot wait for this.
So, all right. Well, hopefully you guys checked out, and until next time. All right. But in all seriousness, the reason we make this content is so that you can know that you have value and that you have worth. So if you or someone you know is struggling right now with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, I encourage you guys to please reach out. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. There are 132 suicides that occur on American soil as of this recording. And when you scale to worldwide status, you'll see that there are 800,000 successful suicides that take place each and every year. So if you're someone you know is struggling, please, we encourage you guys to reach out to us on any of our social media. You guys can call the Suicide Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255 or text HELP to 741-741. All of those resources and more are going to be available at victimsandvillains.net/hope, which you guys can find a link to in the description below, wherever you guys get your podcast from. Until next time, remember to we'll catch you guys next time. We're going to get some coffee.